Hello everyone, this is a presentation covering content for chapter 7, and for this chapter you are completing discussion number 10 and responses to 2 classmates, and then exam number 2, which covers chapters 6 and 7. And here is the discussion question as well. So, chapter 7 on diversity and social work will cover the following learning outcomes. Describes components of diversity and difference, including some really important concepts. Detail the future of multicultural social work practice, including essential knowledge, values, and skills. Evaluate the implications of racial and ethnic identities for social work practice, including specific communities like Blacks or African Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, Hispanic Americans, and non-Hispanic white Americans. Analyze implications for diversity related to gender identity and sexual orientation, and assess the implications for religious and spiritual diversity for social work practice. So some important terms to understand include cultural diversity, which is cultural influences that shape interpretations of situations and guide actions, and also includes identity groups. So race, which is a socially constructed classification emphasizing physiological differences like skin color and facial features, and ethnicity, which is distinguished by a cultural ethos or values, expectations, symbols of a particular group. So types of identity groups include race, ethnicity, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender expression, religion, ability, socioeconomic status, and political affiliations, just to name a few. Some additional important terms to understand include power and privilege. So socially constructed race creates systems of privilege and dominance. Something the text terms minority status is an absence of access to power. So a group of people, community that lacks privilege affects socioeconomic well-being and social acceptance. So we see differences based on household income levels, individual incomes, for example. So these things affect socioeconomic well-being and are really categorized in this privilege and dominance hierarchy. The term people of color is pointing to a vulnerability based on racial discrimination or color bias, and the socially constructed race categories otherize groups. In addition, this term, people of color, some say that is an all-encompassing term, where others say that it's not a term that they enjoy and prefer instead to, if they are a person of color, to say what that looks like. So an African American or a Black person would prefer that label or that kind of category classification if that is something that needs to be done, versus saying a more umbrella term of people of color, because it can tend to put everyone into collapsed groups that doesn't acknowledge the different ways that they interact with society. So some responses to dominance include ways that those in the minority group status respond to dominance vary. So some things to think about here, and is related to resources available. So acculturation is when one submits to dominant culture by adopting their attitudes, values, and norms. Acculturated individuals possibly forsake their cultural heritage in a process, not all at once, so over time, potentially. Assimilation is a two-way process where minority group members blend into dominant groups. We're unable to distinguish groups by cultural characteristics. It's also known as an Americanization process or Anglo-conformity. Really problematic because that assumes that all Americans assimilate in the same way and are the same. expedited by similarities in culture and physical characteristics. Another response to dominance is accommodation, so a coexistence and acceptance of the status quo where minority groups maintain key features of their own culture. So a side-by-side existence, for example, Amish communities that live within our society. An all-out rejection where minority groups hold on to their cultural identity and there's a clash of values, beliefs, customs, which lead to conflict. And a marginality where just because one adopts the norms of another group doesn't mean they accept them, and that they are not marginalized even if they do accept them. So minority groups live at the margins of two cultures that kind of have one foot in two cultures, possibly maybe more. There's conflicts of values, expectations, and loyalties. So how can social workers and all of us appreciate and understand cultural differences better? So here are some kind of ways to do that. One is through cultural pluralism, which affirms the cultural integrity of diverse groups, recognizes what cultural strengths have the potential to do. So remember, social workers really view strengths within everyone. So we not only view them, but cultural pluralism requires us to recognize what cultural strengths have the potential to do. Cultural identity, where we view multicultural rather than monocultural classification, and think that monocultural classification risks stereotyping and labeling. So all of this group does this. So we try to instead view multicultural perspectives. And then intersectionality, I talked about in last chapter's presentation, which is this idea of an interplay of overlapping identities. Again, original author and conceptual genius behind this term is Kimberly Crenshaw, and that it talks about permutations of cultural identity that are infinite and unpredictable, that there are so many different ways that cultural identity exists. And it results in multifaceted identities and complex people, which we know is true. So theories that inform multicultural social work practice include critical theory or critical race theory, standpoint theory, and critical consciousness. So all of these inform this idea of multicultural social work practice. So this type of practice requires practitioners to honor the cultural identities, capabilities, and strengths of diverse clients. It applies to all phases of social work practice. And in order to become a multicultural competent social worker, we have to draw on essential cultural knowledge, humanistic values, and culturally mindful skills, while also understanding, respecting, and relating to all clients, regardless of cultural differences, life experiences, and expectations. So we draw on that knowledge, those values, those skills, while also understanding, respecting, and relating to all clients, regardless of how they differ. Culturally competence practice involves integrating theory about how cultural group memberships frame human experience, developing a critical consciousness about how cultural identity affects the worker-client relationship, so being really in tune to that, exhibiting cultural awareness, acceptance and competence, ensuring that cultural respect is present, adopting a stance of cultural humility, in other words, adopting a stance of a social work practitioner as a learner, developing practice skills suitable for relating with clients in culturally sensitive ways. So critical theory is a lens for analyzing power. So that is what critical theory does for multicultural social work practice, is it includes that power dimension that helps us understand the power differentials between us and our clients, which is very important to think about. Critical race theory draws attention to structural and interactional forces which perpetuate racism. It assumes that racism is common reality in the lives of most people of color, and critical theory and empowerment points to consider to understand cultural complexities include the way that socioeconomic structural arrangements are made, again, hierarchies of power and privilege, for example. Standpoint theory determines how we appraise situations, determine meaning of events, understanding the action of others. So it is a standpoint or vantage point from which every person views the world, and that's how their socio-cultural location is determined. So no one is culturally neutral in this theory. So it really says that not only do those who are in varying identity communities, not only do they have cultural location, but everybody does. And it's important for all of us to know what that looks like for us. And then developing a critical consciousness comes from Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and involves consciousness raising about the way that cultural status, privilege, and oppression interact. It questions structural inequalities. It thinks that critical awareness is very important, and not only being aware, but also taking action. So it's not just the awareness, it's the taking action piece that's also important. So mitigating effects of pre-existing biases and judgmental attitudes. So cultural humility allows us to embrace the not knowing. So how can we mitigate the effects of pre-existing biases and judgmental attitudes? Because the premise here is that all of us have them. So if that's true, then how do we deal with them? One way is through cultural humility, assume the role of the learner, among other things up on the slide. Another thing to consider is that social work values and context really highlight self-awareness, being a part of a community that celebrates diversity, so that our social work value requires us to do that. And for us to develop skills for multicultural social work practice includes confronting microaggressions and the effects of power and privilege. So adopting an anti-oppressive approach, questioning fairness and utility of inequality, and addressing the inequities of privilege. So the identity differential power and privilege associated with cultural group membership. So for persons of wealth, social, economic, and political power. White privilege is dominant in racially stratified societies. Male privilege gives men easy access to social influence and power. Christian privilege devalues and excludes other faiths. So all things to be aware of when examining privilege in a society. When we're talking about microaggressions, so these are types of overt and covert microaggressions that are directed at minority group members. The text differentiates them into micro-assaults, micro-insults, and micro-invalidations, where micro-assaults are intentional name-calling. Micro-insults are often unintentional but demeaning still. And micro-invalidations are unwitting comments that dismiss the feelings, beliefs, and capabilities of others. So this really differentiates between the intent versus the impact. So the intent of the person delivering these messages could be well-intentioned, but the fact is that the impact on that person who heard it includes a compounded sense of powerlessness, negative emotional reactions, feelings of rejection, and devalued self-esteem. So a culturally competent response is to acknowledge the taxing experience of microaggressions and to monitor comments to detect what might be perceived as microaggressions. So this video kind of gives a description of microaggressions, so I'd encourage you to take a look at it if you want more information. So this slide talks about racial and ethnic identities and a demographic shift in our plural nation to the point that it's projected by 2040 40. No racial or ethnic group will constitute a statistical majority. So implications to keep in mind for social work include the effect of generalizations, and the general information provides ideas about how people may differ. So it's important for us to adopt cultural collaboration to understand uniqueness of clients' perspectives and experiences. So this slide kind of further illustrates the point of a white minority, where the red represents white people in the U.S., and how this line is 50%. And so we see by about 2040, the red or the white dips below 50, making white individuals in the U.S. a minority. And so the next several slides basically summarizes the information in the chapter on different groups in the U.S. And so I wanted to provide you with a summary of those items as well as additional resources. So this slide represents general ideas about African Americans, and so I wanted to kind of highlight the things the text talked about, and then I also wanted to provide with additional resources where applicable. So this link takes you to the Black Lives Matter movement website, so that you can check out the different policy statements and actions that are a part of this movement, which I don't think is as well known as some of the more stereotypical or maybe even negative things that people perceive this movement to be about. So I wanted to share that information with you. The next slide represents the Asian American community and the information that's discussed in the chapter. Again, this is another resource that I wanted you to take a look at or be exposed to, which is intersecting analysis done by Drs. G and Peck that analyze equal opportunity and employment data in California's tech industry, and the idea that Asian Americans are typically left out of corporate diversity conversations because many times they're categorized with white workers, and that they're much less likely to be in management or executive positions than white women or men. So an interesting analysis there, kind of highlighting some of the information from the part of the textbook. Next is the slide which represents the Native American, also known as American Indian, Alaska Native or Indigenous people community in the U.S. Discusses the information from the textbook, and then also connects you with a really interesting resource that is a map that helps you understand the land that you're on, so that you know which indigenous population was there before you. So this is a way that folks say we can decolonize kind of what it is that we're doing. So I wanted to provide that resource. And then Hispanic Americans and their community is represented, the information in the text is represented here as well. So some things to kind of consider. And then non-Hispanic white Americans, so the idea of what defines white, and then also the shared values that are stereotypically considered mainstream American values are also listed as the text discusses them. The Arab American community, or a subgroup of Arab Americans, as a fast-growing heterogeneous group with members from various places. So another group that's discussed as well. And so next, the text talks about gender identity and sexual orientation, and then social work practice with sexual minorities. So gender identity, a couple of things to think about here. Gender diversity includes gender identity, and gender expression. So gender as the culturally defined characteristics associated with being male or female. Gender identity as the personal conception of self as male, female, both or neither. Gender expression is a personal expression of gender, which may or may not match binary description. And then individuals who identify as transgender or personal identity differs from their assigned sex. So potential challenges and obstacles include bullying, discrimination in social work, in school and workplace. People can make a choice to either not undergo any physical transformations or opt to undergo medical treatments to acquire the physical characteristics of the sex with which they identify. And this is a choice that people make based on many different factors, so that's something to keep in mind as well when we work with this population. Sexual orientation, we used to think there were only two options, either someone was homosexual or heterosexual, but now know that it's really a continuum of sexual attraction that varies or evolves depending on many different factors. So the context surrounding an individual who comes out is crucial. So the text talks about just the coming out process as an identity development piece of one's life. If it's a validating, the transition can be successful. If it's not, outcomes include abuse, psychological difficulties, and even suicide. And so the text talks about different LGBT identity development, a few different models, and makes the point that experiences really vary depending on different factors. So what does social work practice with sexual minorities look like? Prejudice and oppression that LGBTQIA folks encounter in the social environment endures and represents a lot of the stress that individuals in this community face. Likely clients in all fields of practice will identify as LGBTQIA. Challenges with this population are complicated by the homophobic and heterosexist views in society, by discrimination, and the potential intersection of multiple minority identities, as we talked about that intersectionality piece. So social workers' self-awareness is absolutely vital here. Critically, we need to examine our own narratives and assumptions about sexual minorities and think about our level of comfort or discomfort with this population. And also there are strengths and resources in this community that are abounding. This is a resource of an organization that I used to work very closely with in Louisville called the Fairness Campaign. So I wanted to encourage you to take a look at that. And then the role of political social work with gender and sexual minorities is to really be outspoken about addressing homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, and to take political action to fight against institutional bias and discrimination, work to remove barriers to respectful interactions within social service delivery systems, for example. So this is really kind of our call. So religious diversity, religion in today's world is quite plural. Pluralism, religious pluralism or diversity is a big piece of what that looks like. And that there are differences between religion and spirituality. So spirituality is a personal construct of sacred, including meaning, purpose, and morality, whereas religion includes formal beliefs and practices held in common with others. So this is a really interesting report by the Pew Research Center, which resulted in a really interesting typology of people's religious identity. So you'll see that it really is divided in thirds. So a third of the folks in the survey, which it was done in December in 2017, think of themselves as highly religious. Another third consider themselves somewhat religious, and then another third consider themselves non-religious. And so you can see what those different terms mean, which I think is really interesting. And important to consider the implications for religious privilege. So in the U.S., identification as Christian is a source of privilege and power, often invisible to Christians, but very apparent to those who do not follow Christianity or identify as Christians. So what can social workers do? We, again, need to examine our own beliefs. I think that is a big, basic takeaway, that social workers are constantly having to examine their own belief system. and really acknowledge that there are resources and strengths of the religious and spiritual community, which include social support networks and sources of referrals that are outside of the social service agency realm, that might be places for individuals to improve their well-being. And that is the content for Chapter 7 for Module 4. Thanks, everyone. If you have any questions, let me know.